Bible that does not have God's name in it. Not one time is the name of God found in the book of Esther. Does that mean God's not a part of it? No, it just means that God is not seen and not mentioned, but God is still working in a great and wonderful way. So, how did this? Why are the Israelites in Persia? Well, let's go back and give a little history. And some of you know this, but in case you're a little rusty or you don't know the whole kind of that time period of the captivity. If you remember, Israel was split into two kingdoms. The northern kingdom was overtaken by the Assyrians. They never really came back and reformed their nation again. The southern kingdom of Judah lasted about another 100 years, and then God finally had enough of their sinfulness and their idolatry and all the wickedness that was going on in Israel. So God allowed the Babylonians to come in under King Nebuchadnezzar and overthrow them. They came in three waves. The third wave of the invasion of Babylon, they knocked down the temple, they destroyed Jerusalem, the walls, the city. Jeremiah describes it in the book of Lamentations. Jeremiah is one of the people that are left behind there. He's lamenting, he's crying as he sees the beautiful city of Jerusalem destroyed. Other prophets had been taken to Babylon at this time. Daniel had been taken, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had been taken, Ezekiel had been taken. So some of the people were living in Babylon, and the old and sick and poor and people that really were of no value to the Babylonians were left behind. So now you have the majority of the people living in Babylon. Well, Babylon eventually was taken over by the Medes and Persians. Daniel served under both of those empires. He served under the Babylonian Empire and he served under the Medo-Persian Empire. So when the Medes and Persians took over, there was a king by the name of Cyrus that allowed the Israelites, whoever wanted to go back, they could go back to Jerusalem to rebuild their city and live there again. So a man by the name of Zerubbabel, if you're in my Sunday school class, you should know all this stuff, right? Zerubbabel led about 50,000 Jews back to the land of Israel, and they rebuilt the temple. In doing so, of course, God sent other prophets, and God encouraged them to be faithful as they established now Israel once again. And so there was actually several different groups of people that went back after the 70-year captivity. The first group was Zerubbabel. Second group was led by Ezra. Ezra was a prophet and a priest. He took back another group of people, and they restored spiritual order because people already started backsliding and already were away from God. And then a third group was led by Nehemiah. And Nehemiah rebuilt the walls. And Nehemiah lived during the days of when the Persians were in rule. So in between Ezra and Nehemiah, in the time period is they rebuilt the temple somewhere around 515. Nehemiah led a group in 444, just kind of give you an idea. And so sometime in between that rebuilding of the temple and the Nehemiah going back is the story of Esther. Now, under Nehemiah, he served under a king named Artaxerxes. He was the fifth ruler of the Persian Empire. But in the story of Esther, we see that there is a king by the name of Ahasuerus. He was the fourth king. So Esther is right before Nehemiah. And it's a story of what happened in Israel. And this story is very important because there was potentially, a threat to all of Israel. Israel could have been wiped out in Persia. There could have been no more Israel, no more Judah, at least, the majority of people. There's still people, of course, living in Judah, in Israel. All right, so let's look at this story now. The story of Esther, as we said, takes place in Shushan, which is the capital of the Persian Empire. Now, why would God care to write a book about this and care about his people? Think about this. Anybody could have gone back to their home country of Israel. But a lot of people chose not to. A lot of people grew up in Israel, in Persia, and they just said, we're just going to stay here. Our parents lived here. We're not going to go back, and they chose to live out their days in Persia. Now, God didn't tell everybody they had to go back to Israel. And so a lot of folks didn't do that. They had comfortable lives and just chose to live there. All right, so let's get into the story. First point I want to give you tonight, let's look at the Persian queen at this time. Persian queen, a lot of things are going to happen around the queen at that time. Her name was Vashti. So let's look once again at verse 1. We see the name of the king, Ahasuerus. Now notice in verse number 1, what was the scope, or what were the dimensions of his kingdom? Notice what it says. Where did it go from? From where to where? From India to Ethiopia. Now, maybe that doesn't mean anything to you, but you think about Israel's here, India. Janice, where's India? Way far away, right? Janice from India. But way to the far east is India. Ethiopia, in what continent is Ethiopia? In Africa. It's the northern part of Africa. So from the northern part of Africa all the way over to the east, where India is. And, if you have a Bible map, you can look it up and see that it's quite a large empire. And notice it says how many provinces were there in Persia at that time. How many? There was over 107 and 20. Now they kind of give the numbers a little bit backwards there. 127 provinces. So it's divided up. There's states, if you will. Like we have 50 states in America. They had 127. And so you can see the magnitude of the Persian Empire was tremendous. And it says that King Ahasuerus sat on the throne. Of course, he was the fifth king of that kingdom, which was in Shushan the palace. Now, note verse number 3. In the third year of his reign, so he's only been there 3 years, he made a feast unto all the princes and servants, the power of Persia and Media, the nobles and princes of provinces being before him. All right, so let's see now, as we see Ahasuerus. By the way, he had another name. His name was Xerxes, not Artaxerxes, but Xerxes, Xerxes. That's a Greek name. And so in the third year, this was somewhere around 482 BC, just kind of give you an idea, 482 years before the time of Christ. And he's going to now prepare a feast. So let's look at the festival, all right? So our first point on that should be the festival. Now this festival was going to rally the people around and encourage them. The festival would be there, would take place for 180 days. That's 180 days. Well, how long is 180 days? 6 months, half a year. Feast, festival, half a year. Why 6 months of this big festival, and what was the purpose of it? Well, there was an upcoming empire, great nation, that started to flex its muscles, and that was the land of Greece. The Greek Empire now started to become very strong, and Xerxes or Ahasuerus wanted to revenge the loss his father, the king before him, lost to the Greeks. So now he is rallying everybody around. We're going to have a big 6 months because we're going to go back to war again. And he wants to get the people in a good mood and get them all fired up and get them all in one accord. So they have invites all the nobles, all the leaders, and now they're going to prepare to go to battle against the Athenians, who were, of course, Greeks, and they had defeated the Persians in the Battle of Marathon. I wonder if it was a long battle. The Battle of Marathon in 490 BC. Maybe that's where we get the name Marathon, because the length of the battle. Any idea? John, you're a scholar. What do you think?
Yeah, so Marathon was where the battle was at, and then the guy ran 20-some miles, or whatever it is, 26 miles, to warn Athens that they weren't defeated. So that's where Marathon.
Oh, very good. Thank you for that little tidbit of information. I went to those online maybe didn't hear, our resident scholar, John Bradford, said that one of the guys ran from Marathon back to Athens to tell how the battle was going. It was 26 miles, and therefore that's how a marathon became known. Thank you. Appreciate that. Anyhow, you want to add anything else tonight, you can always just raise your hand and add to that. Now, Daniel had prophesied, interesting enough, that all these kingdoms would come and go. He prophesied about Babylon losing to the Medes and Persians losing to the Greeks. And in Daniel chapter 11, verse 2, he prophesied how that Medes and Persia had great wealth, great military, but they eventually are going to lose to the Greek Empire. And, that is going to be the next great empire. So we're kind of right, in between, a transitioning between empires. All right, so the festival was, as we mentioned, 6 months. All the nobles, all the leaders, all gathered together, and so this is his way of preparing people. Verse 4: He showed the riches of his glorious kingdom and the honor of his excellent majesty many days. And so, the guy was probably filled with pride, wanted to show everybody, here's our wealth, here's everything that we have, the glorious kingdom, reminding them of how great a nation they truly were. Well, let's look at the second aspect now. Let's look at the feast. So we see a festival took place for how many days? 180, 6 months. But now, at the conclusion of the festival, he's going to pronounce there's going to be a feast now of 7 days. And it's going to be a little bit different than a festival. So let's look at verse number 5. And when these days were expired, the king made a feast unto all the people that were present in Shushan the palace, both unto great and small, 7 days in the court of the garden of the king's palace, where were white, green, and blue hangings fastened with cords of fine linen and purple to silver rings, and pillars of marble. The beds were gold and silver upon pavement of red, blue, whites, black marble. Well, all the descriptions. That's for all the ladies, because they wanted to know how it was decorated. And so that's the decorations. And verse number 7, and they gave them drink in vessels of gold, the vessels being diverse one from another. So, golden vessels, they're all different, all handcrafted. Once again, showing off their wealth. And royal wine, hey, just not that cheap stuff. The royal wine was being given to everybody in abundance according to the state of the king. Now look at verse 8. And the drinking was according to the law. None did compel, so the king had appointed to all the officers of his house that they should do according to every man's pleasure. You know what the law was? You can drink all you want, or you don't have to drink anything. So they weren't compelled to drink, they weren't compelled not to. So it's basically everybody could do whatever they want to. Now, in verse number 8, when it says that they were having a feast, that actually, in the original language, denotes not only a feast, but a drinking feast. It was all about drinking. One of the historians of that era said that the Persians would drink large amounts of alcohol during their feast. And so you can tell what kind of feast this ends up. What is it? It's just a drunken feast. So for 7 days, they're getting drunk, they're drinking a lot of wine, they're all the nonsense that goes on with drunkenness, I'm sure, is happening there. And so this is all happening. But you know what? It's a men's only group. All the guys with the king are having this 7-day drunken fest. Now what happens to the ladies? Look at verse 9. Also Vashti, we're introduced to Vashti now, the queen, made a feast for the women in royal house which belonged to King Ahasuerus. So while the men are having their party, the queen is hosting her party. And of course, I'm sure she wasn't having some drunken feast like the men were having, but she was having a feast for all the women, which in one of the houses, of course, that belonged to the king. All right, so we see the festival 6 months, feast now followed up by a drunken feast for 7 days. And now let's look at a third aspect. Let's look at a fight. A fight's going to break out. In verse number 10, on the 7th day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, it's a nice way of saying he was drunk. And his heart was merry, he's feeling good under the influence of much wine. He commanded, these are some hard names here, so I'm going to just kind of zip through them. Mehuman, Biztha, Harbona, Bigtha, Abagtha, Zether, and Carcass, or something like that. The 7 chamberlains that served in the presence of Ahasuerus the king. Now, the word chamberlains in verse number 10 is the word which means they were eunuchs. Now, eunuch was a man who was, let's just say, biologically altered so that, they could not participate in procreation. And so the eunuchs were usually, servants there, and, that's took care of the king, and the king didn't have to worry about any of them flirting with his wife. But anyhow, verse number 11. So he tells us his 7 eunuchs in verse 11 to bring Vashti, the queen, before the king with the crown royal to show the people and the princes her beauty, for she was fair to look on. So the drunken king, hey, go tell my wife to come, and I want everybody to look at her. And now this didn't mean she was going to come and disrobe or anything like that, but, women in the Persian culture were very modest. They would usually have veils over their head and, cover up, kind of like you see some of the Muslim women do now, where it's sometimes you can only see, just their eyes. So he came and he invited her, come and at least show her face, what she looked like. He was proud of her beauty. He wanted all the men to see how beautiful of a wife he had. Now, once again, this is all about his pride. He had already shown them all his wealth. He showed them all the power, the glorious kingdom. Now he wants to say, here, now look at my wife. I got it all. Well, the only problem is she didn't want to come. She didn't want to come, bunch of drunks. Can you blame her, ladies? Come and show off your beauty to a bunch of drunken guys, been all partying for 7 days, no telling what would be said or what nonsense was going to go on. And so if you see here, it says, verse 12, but the queen Vashti refused to come at the king's commandment by his chamberlains. Therefore was the king very wroth, and his anger burned in him. Man, don't say no to the king. The king orders you to come, you come. But she said, I'm not coming. Now, we don't know Vashti's morals, but maybe we assume that maybe she was a moral woman. Possibly she understood that her refusal to come and show off her beauty could mean that she would get in trouble and possibly lose her position as being a queen. But evidently, she felt so strongly that she should not go there and show off her beauty, that she was willing, I guess, to accept whatever the consequences would be for her refusal to come and participate in the feast with her husband, the king. So this fight ensues, and so the king's mad. He's embarrassed. He's sent for her. She doesn't come. He probably made an announcement to all his buddies, hey, my wife's going to come. And then, where is she? She's not going to come. She said she didn't want to come. So he's embarrassed. He's probably upset, and he's mad. He's angry. Kings were not used to having people say no to them. So, verse 13. Then the king said unto the wise men. By the way, notice, wise men. Persia, wise men. Does that ring a bell? Remember the wise men that came from Persia during the time of Christ, 400 years later. These wise men would be magi, astrologers. You know, these are people that kind of were involved in reading the stars and making predictions and things of this nature. And so they maybe were magicians as such. But anyhow, then the king said unto the wise men, which knew the times, for so it was the king's manner toward all the new law and judgment. And the next unto him was, oh man, now I got some more names, right? Karshena, Shethar, Admatha, Tarshish, that one's easy, Meres, Marsina, and Memucan, the 7 princes of Persia and Media, which saw the king's face, which sat the first in his kingdom. So these were the wise men. He had 7 men there. And he wants to find out, what should we do? What's the answer? My wife won't come. She's disobeyed me. She's rebelled against me. He probably wants to see, is there some law? What can we do about this? So verse 15. What shall we do unto the queen Vashti, according to law, because she hath not performed the commandment of the king Ahasuerus by the chamberlain? Now, of the 7 guys, one guy steps up, and he's kind of the spokesperson. Memucan, in verse 16. And Memucan answered before the king and the princes, Vashti. The queen, before the king and princes, Vashti, the queen, hath not done wrong to the king only, but also to all the princes and to all the people that are in all the provinces of the king Ahasuerus. Now, wait a minute. He's saying that this is not just hurting the king. Who's it hurting? All the men, all the guys. He goes on, basically, as we read his comment, that if we don't do something about this, all the women are going to say, hey, the queen, she said no. We can say no too. So that's a bad example. And so, verse 17, for this deed of the queen shall come abroad unto all women, so that they shall despise their husbands in their eyes. When it shall be reported, the king Ahasuerus commanded Vashti the queen to be brought in before him, but she came not. Notice, all the women, they're going to despise their husbands. Now, what do you mean they're going to hate their husband? It means that anytime that he says something that they don't want to do, they're going to voice their displeasure. They're going to show that, we're going to stand up. You know what? They were afraid of having women's livers. Women's livers. And now, we know what the Bible says. Good ladies, right? Ladies are to be in subjection to their husbands. Amen, ladies? I didn't hear any amens. All right, but anyhow, whenever I do a wedding, I haven't done a wedding in a while, but, at the end where they have the vow, in the middle when you have the vows, and the guys just to do you blah, 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 do this, that, and everything. Yeah, I do. And then for the women, to love, cherish, and obey. Boy, sometimes ladies, they give me the look. Did you have to say that word, Okay, I'll say it today, but that doesn't mean it. I got my fingers crossed, Now, we know that in God's economy of the marriage that God made the men the leaders. That doesn't mean we're better, doesn't mean we're smarter, wiser, more spiritual, doesn't mean anything. But it just simply meant, it started with Adam and Eve. When Eve was deceived, God said, look, we need to have a spiritual leader in the family. And so that was the method that God created for the family. And once again, men are not to lord over their wives, or not to demand them do unreasonable things and, basically turn them into subservient people. But God says, that there should be a leader. There should be, the lady should follow the leadership. And if the man is spiritual and he leads properly, and the lady's spiritual and she follows properly, everything works perfect. But sometimes the guys don't lead spiritually, and so that causes a problem. Sometimes ladies don't want to follow the man, that causes problems. And, so anyhow. So they wanted to find out, what can we do to avoid the women liberation in Persia? And so they said, we are going to set the tone. We're going to make an example out of Vashti so that no woman is going to do what she's done. And so verse 18, likewise shall the ladies of Persia and Media say this day unto all the king's princes which have heard of the deed of the queen, thus shall there arise too much contempt and wrath. If it please the king, let there go a royal commandment, and let him from him, and let it be written among the laws of the Persians and the Medes. Have you ever heard of that? The law of the Medes and Persians? What does that mean? It cannot be changed. The law of the Medes and Persians, once it's a law, you can't veto that law, you can't change that law, you can't overrule that law. It will always be a law. So when they set a law, that's it. So we're going to set a law. And here's the law. He says that Vashti come no more before the king Ahasuerus, and let the king give her royal estate unto another that is better than she. So she's getting kicked out. She's going to be replaced. She can't be queen anymore. And that'll be a law. And no matter what happens, we can't go back against the law. She can never be the queen, and somebody else better than her, someone more subservient, submissive, is going to take her place. And so what are we seeing now? We're seeing a plan is now being put into effect so that this can never happen again to any household. And so when the king's verse 20, when the king's decree, which shall be published throughout all his empires, for it is great, all the wives shall give to their husbands honor, both to great and small. So man, they sent a message out to everybody. The queen's getting fired. Ladies, listen up. You go against your husband, there's going to be consequences. So, and the saying pleased the king and the princes. And the king did according to the word of Memucan, for he sent letters unto all the king's provinces. How many king's provinces were there? 127. So man, they went out, Pony Express, everywhere. From India to Ethiopia. It's pretty long, pretty big, right? Everybody, word went out there, every corner of the empire. Here's the rule. Vashti got replaced. She was going to be replaced. A lot of Medes and Persians. And ladies, you better listen up. We made an example out of the queen. So anyhow, and it says, and every people after their language, and every man should bear rule in his own house, that it should be published according to the language of every people. So there are different language groups. Everybody learned what the new law was. All right, well, we go to chapter 2, and some time passes by. Verse number 1 of chapter 2 says this: after these things, when the wrath of King Ahasuerus was appeased, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what was decreed against her. Now notice it says, after these things, in essence, so there's a time frame. Now let's go to the second point tonight. We're going to have to search for a new queen. We're going to have to search for the new queen. Now, we know that some time went by, and actually it was about 4 years. So the queen had not been replaced for 4 years. So 4 years goes by. It's now the 7th year, because Esther, spoiler alert, becomes a queen. She becomes queen in the 7th year. The decree was in the 3rd year, so you have 4 years. Well, what was going on in 4 years? Hey, you remember what were they having that big festival for? They were preparing for war. They went to war with the Greeks. How did it go? Not good. Just like Marathon again, right? And so now he didn't avenge his father's defeat. Greece is now a mighty power. Remember a little guy by the name of Alexander the Great? He's going to be leading the Greeks eventually to overthrow the Medes and Persians. But anyhow, so he's demoralized, he's depressed, he feels like a failure. Things didn't work out. He comes back, the war is over now, and he remembers his queen. And he's probably looking for companionship, looking for somebody to say, oh dear, I'm sorry you lost. Here's a hamburger. and I'll turn on the TV for you, and you'll feel a lot better, you know. Let me get your slippers and your pipe. Ladies, don't get your husband a pipe. But anyhow, I'm sure he's thinking about the fact that now he's not with his queen anymore. And he's not mad at her anymore. It's 4 years have gone by. He's remembered her. But what did he remember? The decree. What did the decree say? She can no longer be queen. And that was the law of the Medes and Persians. So he couldn't even go back. He couldn't, even if he said, I forgive you, honey, come on back. He wasn't allowed to do that. Law of Medes and Persians said, she cannot be your queen anymore. So he's lonely and he's discouraged and he just lost in a battle and, you know, the king's not doing too well. So he his advisors get together in verse 2. Then said the king's servants that ministered unto him, let there be a fair young virgin sought for the king. And let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of his kingdom, that they may gather together all the fair young virgins into Shushan the palace, to the house of the women, unto the custody of Hegi, the king's chamberlain, keeper of the women, and let their things be their things for purification be given them, and let the maiden. Is that my phone? Goodness gracious. This phone has a voice. All right. It said, I didn't understand that. Verse 4, and let the maiden which pleaseth the king be queen instead of Vashti, and the thing pleased the king. And he did so. Now, normally they would just have a group of women that were of nobility. And, you know, they would usually handpick one of the women to be the next queen. But now, no, that's not going to do. What are they going to have? A beauty contest. 127 provinces. Go find the most beautiful virgins in all the land, from India to Ethiopia. Boy, you talk about looking for Miss Universe, you know? Let's find the most beautiful, the one that is the one that pleases the king. Now, we're not sure how many women were invited, but Josephus, who was a historian during the times of Christ, so about 400 years later, actually, than the writing of this, recorded that he believes that there were about 400 women that made the cut. 400 women to choose from. And so all these beautiful women from all across the land all come together. Who's going to be the next queen? Kind of sounds like that, you know, those stupid TV shows like The Bachelor and Bachelorette and all those. Don't watch any of that nonsense. It's all ridiculous nonsense. And, you know, here's a guy who's going to pick from these women, and here's a woman, she's going to pick from these guys, you know. It's all ridiculous. It's all reality TV, which is nonsense anyhow. But they're going to have a beauty contest there, and the king gets to pick whoever he wants. So they're all brought to this palace, a harem of women, if you will, and one of the eunuchs, whose name was Hegi, was in charge of keeping all the women together and making sure they had everything needed to stay beautiful, and, you know, all the makeup they needed and perfume and, you know, everything else that they needed. I don't think they had nylons back in those days, or, you know, everything else that, you know, of course, women, I don't know. Anyhow, let's move on. Number 3. Let's look at the introduction of Esther. Well, now, we haven't even come to the main person yet. Now we're going to be introduced to the two main characters outside of the king in verse number 5. Now in Shushan the palace there was a certain Jew whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjamite. Well, who else came from the family of Kish and a Benjamite? King Saul. So Mordecai had originally some royal blood flowing through him. Of course, you know, the Benjamites, if Saul would have messed up, would have been the royal line, but then he messed up, and Judah became the royal line. under David, but he would have been a descendant of King Saul. Now Mordecai, it says that he lived in the palace. So what does that mean? He had a government position. Why would a Jew have a government position? Well, same way Daniel had a government position. Same way Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had government positions. One of the things that when they selected Jews so that they could put them into the government, and so he had a position of authority. And so notice in verse number 5, who had been carried away from Jerusalem. He's talking about his forefathers, carried away from Jerusalem with the captivity, which had been carried away with Jeconiah, the king of Judah. That was one of the kings who was taken into captivity, officially under Nebuchadnezzar's, whenever Nebuchadnezzar overthrew Jerusalem. The king of Babylon had carried away. Now he brought up Hadassah. That is Esther. So Esther has another name, as Alan spoiled the program by telling us Hadassah was her official name, but she also went by the name of Esther. Anybody know what, Alan, do you know what Hadassah means? Oh, I thought you knew everything, Alan. All right, just hurry up, Google it real quick. Hadassah means myrtle, and myrtle is of course, it's a tree, but also is a sweet-smelling perfume. But her name, the Persian name, Esther, means twinkle, twinkle, little star. There you go, I gave you a hint. So Esther means star, and so we're introduced. Now, Esther had been orphaned. We don't know what happened to her mom and dad, but they both died, and so she was under the watch care of Mordecai. Mordecai was her cousin. So, Mordecai's father was her uncle, so that made Mordecai her cousin. And verse 7, and he brought up Hadassah, that is Esther, the uncle's daughter, for she had neither father nor mother, and the maid was fair and beautiful, whom Mordecai, when her father and mother were dead, took for his own daughter. So, now, verse 8 says, "It came to pass when the king's commandment and his decree was heard, that many maidens were gathered together unto Shushan the palace to the custody of Hegai, that Esther was brought also into the king's house to the custody of Hegai, keeper of the women." Well, Hegai has all these women. He's a eunuch, so, we already kind of explained what the eunuch's situation was. And he's going to be in charge of all these women. And of all these women, guess who he takes a fancy to? He takes a fancy to Esther, and he gives her preferential treatment above all the other women. And so verse 9 says, "And the maiden pleased him, and she obtained." So let me give you a couple of subpoints here under that. Number 1, at home with Mordecai. We already introduced Mordecai. Then she's going to be in the home with Hegai, all right? And this is a special palace for all the women waiting for the beauty contest. Now the thing is, though, in a regular beauty contest, they parade all the women out at one shot, and they have judges, they decide who wins. But this beauty contest is going to be a little bit different. Every woman would have one night to spend with the king. Now, I'm not sure all what went on. I'm not sure, what spending the day or the night with the king was all about, but they would prepare for an entire year, 12 months. They would get all ready to go, and they were going to be interviewed by the king. And so all these women now, I'm sure many of them were excited and thinking, could I be the one chosen? Now, we don't know Esther's situation. We don't read anything spiritual about Esther at this point. And sometimes she's elevated to be this great woman, but, I see some compromises here. She was potentially could be married to a pagan king. She was chosen with all these other virgins, and, who knows what the king would demand the day and the night that, she would meet with him. So, it's kind of a gray area, shall we say, about, her morals, her ethics, things like that. But here's the thing. God was in it all, despite what Esther had done. And God could see the future. God's going to know what's going to happen. So he needs somebody that has some power and authority in the kingdom It's just like Daniel was given power and authority in the kingdom, just like Joseph was given power and authority in Egypt. God needed somebody to have power and authority in that particular kingdom. So all the women got all prepared, and all one after the next would show up before the king. Once again, we don't know Esther, what her situation was. We don't know if she ate the king's meat and drank the king's wine. Remember, Daniel's friends didn't do that. So, who knows what compromises were made. Well, the last thing we're going to look at tonight is in the palace with Ahasuerus. In verse number 13, it talks about, then thus came every maiden unto the king. Whatsoever she desired was given her to go in and out of the house of the women in the king's house. In the evening she went, and on the morrow she returned in the second house. So basically, they were all interviewed. They were all appeared before the king. And, if the king didn't pick them, they got sent back to the house. And if they never called their name again, they just kind of lived out the rest of their days, as a concubine, or as a, somebody that met with the king for one day, but that was it, didn't make the cut. But verse 15, now when the turn of Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her for a daughter, was come to go into the king, she required nothing but that Hegai, the king's chamberlain. So she didn't ask for anything special, any special outfit, nothing extra. And so she just went in. And Esther obtained favor in the sight of all them that looked upon her. So Esther was taken unto King Ahasuerus in his house, in his house royal in the 10th month, which is the month Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. And the king loved Esther. It was love at first sight. Isn't that romantic? And he loved her. Now, how could he love her? Well, she was beautiful. She probably had a beautiful spirit about her. She didn't come in like Vashti. I ain't going to none of your parties. So whatever it was, it appealed to her. She had not only beautiful outwardly, but she was beautiful inwardly. And appealed to the king. And wow, as soon as he saw her, he knew that she was the one. And so she obtained grace and favor in the sight more than all the other virgins, so that he set the royal crown upon her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. So she won. She won the contest. You are the next queen over the land of Persia. Well, now, what does that call for? Well, you have to have a big feast, right? Kind of like church. When there's something special, you got to have a luncheon. But anyhow, verse 18, then the king made a great feast unto the prince and his servants, even Esther's feast, and he made a release to the provinces and gave gifts according to the state of the king. And so we end today's lesson with a queen has been selected. Her name is Esther. She is Jewish. Now, the only thing about it, we didn't talk about this, but she did not tell anybody that she was a Jew, because while she was waiting for her turn to go meet with the king, Mordecai would come in on a regular basis and visit with her. And he instructed her, don't tell anybody you are Jewish. Why is that? Because she would have been considered a foreigner. Now, of course, there were women from all different people groups, but maybe he sensed that there was some possible persecution for the Jews, and so it was best not to mention that she was Jewish. So that's where we are tonight. Next week, we'll continue with the story and see where it goes. All right, we're going to say goodbye to those who are watching online, and we're going to go to prayer for those who are here in the auditorium. And if you look at your prayer sheet, I didn't get one for some reason, but we put a couple new folks on there. Pray for Jason Stamos. Jason has